and welcome to all of you to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyke, CEO of Urban Green, coming to you live from Studio Urban Green in Lower Manhattan. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a net zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live Q&A in just a bit. Now, next week is Thanksgiving, a festival of literal bounty. And with it, a lot of food waste that has big environmental consequences. Many people would be surprised to know that if food waste was a country, it would be the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases behind China and the United States. There's just a lot of carbon in our food that we're going to unpack today with my guest. This is an issue that's near and dear to me. It's rooted in a book I actually co-authored called Food Foolish, which examines the hidden connections of food waste to hunger and climate change. So my guest today is one of the world's foremost food waste experts. Dana Gunders is the executive director of ReFed, former food waste lead at NRDC, and the author of the Waste-Free Kitchen Handbook. Dana, welcome to Urban Green Live.
Thank you so much, John. Great to be here with you.
We're so happy that you've joined us today. Dana, let's start. Talk to us about ReFed. What's it all about and what's the work that you do?
Sure. So ReFed is a national nonprofit in the US. We are entirely focused on reducing the amount of food that goes to waste around the country. We do that by focusing on three main pillars. One is providing data and insights on the topic. And our main channel for that is through a tool we have on our website called the Insights Engine that has a whole analysis across the supply chain of how much food is going to waste, how much it costs to do certain solutions, how much food that those solutions can save, and all sorts of other aspects of the issue. So provide data on the topic is one. Secondly, we try to catalyze more capital into the space. And so we work with private investors, philanthropic organizations, public organizations to help attract and then direct any investment in the space. And the other part of that is really keeping up on what's happening so that we can help advise where those investments can go. So for instance, on our website, we have a directory of about 900 different organizations that are providing solutions in the space. And then, so we do that data, we do the capital and innovation. And then the third pillar of our work is stakeholder engagement. We really act as a hub and connector in the space. We host the big conference of the year when you can host conferences. We have a network of over 500 individuals who are practicing in the space. And we do a lot of programming and kind of thought leader pieces, things like that.
That's so impressive, Dana. Tell us, how old is ReFed and why was it founded?
So ReFed was really founded on a report before it was a report before it was an organization. And that report came out in 2016. And it was an analysis, at the time, people had kind of just started talking about the issue of how much food was going to waste, but no one really knew exactly where to start or what to do about it. And so that report, the first ReFed roadmap, which came out in 2016, analyzed 27 different solutions to food waste for how much food they would save and how much they would cost to implement and save in dollars, because a lot of times you can actually save a lot of money. And that report got so much traction that there were started to be projects after that, and ultimately it became a 501c3 only in 2019. So we're pretty young as an organization.
I was excited when that report first came out, and I used it a lot. It's really kind of like the equivalent of the McKinsey climate curve report, that ReFed report, which really set the baseline for the issue in the United States. So let's talk about the scale of food waste, which that report really helped to bring to life, and other work that you've done. How much are we wasting, and where are we wasting our food?
Yeah, so in the US, about 35% of all of our food goes unsold or uneaten. So it's a huge number. The value of that food is over $400 billion, equivalent to about 2% of US GDP. The greenhouse gas impact or footprint of all that food is um, equivalent to about 58 million cars worth of greenhouse gases, or 4% of the US footprint. And that's to say nothing about all the water involved in growing and producing that food that ultimately is wasted when the food is not used, as well as fertilizers, pesticides, soil health and use. So it takes a lot to grow food. We commit a huge amount of resources to growing food, transporting it, cooling it, storing it, cooking it, getting it to our table. So when we throw it out, it all of that is for naught. And of course, alongside that, and this is something that really came forward during the pandemic, we have over 40 million people in the US who are considered food insecure, meaning at some point during the year, they may not know where their next meal will come from. So it's kind of these dual problems that exist side by side, which is truly unfortunate and tragic in some cases. Where it happens, so I like to say food waste is not one problem. It's a very different problem if you're talking about tomatoes going unharvested on the farm, or potatoes on a breakfast platter that don't get eaten. And it's really a challenge of design and effectiveness and efficiency of our food system throughout. So you find food going to waste throughout the supply chain. In fact, the largest contributor is us, 330 million of us in our homes throwing food out, little bits and pieces, cleaning our fridge, not finishing our meals each day. And that's about 37% of the whole pie of food waste is coming from households. Second, kind of tied for second, are food service, so restaurants, cafeterias, college dining halls, those sorts of things, as well as farms. We lose a lot of food that is grown on the farm when it doesn't get harvested for reasons of quality or looks or pricing. There's all sorts of reasons that actually quite a bit of food that's perfectly edible does not get harvested.
So I was excited to do this program because a lot of people just don't see this hidden waste. I mean, you've just pointed it out to us. 35% of our food goes wasted in the United States. Globally, it's about 40%, so we're not far behind. It's probably one of the most inefficient systems in our society. I mean, we don't tolerate that sort of inefficiency anywhere else, yet we've come to accept it for the main resource to sustain the human race. It's kind of crazy. And the number one place we're doing it is in the household. It's us. So why do you think that is? Like, why are we wasting so much food? Let's start at the household level, and then we'll move down the chain that you just talked about.
Sure. I think, a couple root causes I would say are, one is that food is a relatively low cost for us in the US. So we spend less of our budget on food in the US as consumers than any other country in the world. So we just don't have that same signal that some other places do, where food can be, 30, 40% of consumers' budgets. So, in the home, I think at the root cause is that it's not a huge cost for many Americans, not everyone, but for many Americans, it's not enough. The second thing is it's invisible, right? So we don't really pay attention to it. It's happening in little bits and pieces through the course of the year. And so we're not really tallying it, and therefore it kind of goes under our radar. The third piece is that once it's going to waste, we've all had that fridge clean out and found that science experiment in the back of the fridge. It's too late, right? What are you going to do at that point? And the big challenge of reducing food waste in the home is that you have to think upstream. It's about managing your food well. It's about thinking about it when you're buying it, when you're storing it, when you're deciding what to have for dinner. But by the time it's bad, it's bad. So I think that's the third part, is it's a problem that's happening kind of displaced in time from when you have to do something about it.
What's the role that date labels are playing at the household level with consumers?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons, that like in our habits that food is going to waste in homes. One of the things that happens a lot is that the dates on food tend to get misinterpreted. So really, the dates on food are not meant to tell you that it's bad or that you will be sick after, if you eat it. They're really meant to indicate the freshness or best quality of that food. They're not federally regulated. They're regulated on a very inconsistent ad hoc basis at the state level across the country. But fundamentally, when food is past that date, if it looks fine, smells fine, tastes fine, you can actually eat it. There's a lot of confusion out there about why people get sick from food. So when you hear about salmonella or E. coli or these illness outbreaks that happen from food, it's not because the food is old. It's because it has these pathogens on it that we recognize, that we've heard about. And those will get you sick whether or not the food is old or not. But people are kind of scared as food ages, and they're using those dates as a substitute. And so I think being able to clarify for people that those dates do not actually mean that is a really key step in people kind of getting to know how to manage their food and being comfortable with it.
So then next on the list you said was the kind of the institutional side of food. So why is it wasted there? Is it impossible to do the planning, or how do you think that works and why?
Yeah, so in restaurants and food service, I was actually surprised in the analysis that we came out with in February to see that the biggest cause is food on plates. It's what we call plate waste, which is after food is sold, it's on people's plates. It's what you don't finish and you leave there, and then you get up and leave the restaurant. And so that's actually a huge cause, much more so, in fact, than anything that's going to waste in the back in the kitchen. Certainly that happens as well. But really trying to take a look at the portion sizes we're serving, and pretty much it boils down to portion sizes, and then the way that we're kind of offering food. Do you have to when you order the sandwich, does it automatically come with fries, or do you get to choose between three things and end up with something that you're more likely to eat? So I think that looking at that is a key opportunity area. It's really hard. Americans like their portions, whether or not they eat them. So it's a tricky one, but it's a space that really needs to be looked at.
It's interesting. I've seen the analysis on the simple size of food items and how they've grown in the United States. Like the size of a hamburger today is in a retail setting is much larger than it was 20 years ago. The one that everybody can relate to if you're more than 40 years old and can see it. But like when I grew up, the size of a cookie was a cookie, right? It was like that big, right? Today, cookies are this big. They're like flying saucers. I mean, and it's just, I think it's a symptom of why we're wasting so much food, because these portion sizes are getting bigger. So next week, we timed this episode the week before Thanksgiving on purpose. Next week is Thanksgiving. We talked about this earlier. I collaborated on analysis several years ago that found a dinner with 8 people will waste the carbon equivalent of 1.1 billion passenger car miles nationally over Thanksgiving. And the wasted water, you had talked about this earlier, the wasted water in that food is the equivalent to leaving the bathroom faucet running 2 hours for every guest at your table. So if you have a party of 8, that's 16 hours that you turn the faucet on and just let it run. So Dana, how do we get people to think differently about this issue? You talked about how it's hidden. How do we get people to think differently?
Yeah, well, it's a big task, right? Overall, I think Thanksgiving is a great time to talk about it. First of all, for what Thanksgiving stands for, right? I mean, the whole reason behind Thanksgiving is that people were so thrilled that they had enough food to last through the winter, right? That they were celebrating that. And I think there's so much irony in the fact that we get together to celebrate that and be thankful for having food, really, ultimately. And yet it's one of the times when we throw away more food than any other. So, yeah, I think, getting people, and there's maybe two parts to your question. One is just in general, how do we get people to start paying more attention to this? And I think it's as much about people understanding how much it takes to get food to you as it is about not wasting it, right? Because if you can really sort of understand that, you will hold it in a higher value. I like to say, when you mentioned the water for turkeys, one easy one that I always pull out is that when you throw out a hamburger, it's the equivalent of taking a 90-minute shower in terms of the water it took to produce that hamburger. And if we kind of thought about that every time we were throwing something out, or even better, before, it would help us just have the right mindset, because there's a lot of tips and tricks to wasting less food, but ultimately it boils down to having the mindset that you don't like, that this is something that's really important, and it's something that, hey, while I'm lazy and want to put a frozen pizza in the oven tonight, I'm not going to, because I know I have that food that I meant to cook, and it's sitting in the fridge, and I'm gonna step up and take the 20 minutes it takes to actually make that for dinner. That sort of thing. And I think without that mindset, it's really hard. So how do we get people to adopt that? I mean, one thing I was involved in was a big campaign, like a big national campaign that got started and I think just didn't run for long enough, called Save the Food. It's actually something that we're working on trying to bring back and galvanize enough interest and support and funding to actually launch a longer term consumer awareness effort around this. Because without having that, I do think that traditional consumer awareness approach that worked for not littering, for instance, is kind of needed around this issue as well. So I think that's big picture. More specifically, it's getting people the tips and tricks that they can use to actually do it, because nobody wakes up wanting to waste food, right? And they're like, hey, I'm going to waste food today. It's just they're standing in their kitchen with a wrinkled tomato and they don't know if it's okay to eat it and they don't know what to do with it. And so it's getting them that specific information. So, and it's everything from, how do you plan meals? And what does it mean to plan meals? Planning meals is one of the most effective things that you can do to not waste food. But for a lot of people, that's like, plan is a 4-letter word, right? and yet it can be done in 5 minutes. You can sit down and go, I'm going to have pasta on Monday and leftovers on Tuesday and frozen pizza on Wednesday. That counts. That's a totally legitimate plan. But taking that time to sit down and kind of match what you're buying with what you're going to do that week is a really important role. So kind of communicating and teaching people what it is and what it doesn't have to be is part of the role too. And then of course, tips and tricks on, hey, how do you use up your leftovers? Around Thanksgiving, we actually see a lot of this, a lot of like recipes around, turkey banh mi to use up your leftovers, those sorts of things. And I think that actually really ultimately in aggregate is pretty helpful. Specific to Thanksgiving, there are some things to think about and some tricks. One is thinking about when you're planning your meals. So a common pitfall during Thanksgiving is like, okay, we're going to have, 10 people for dinner. So here's what we're going to make. We're going to make casserole and sweet potatoes and turkey and these like 8 dishes, right? And then you look up your recipes and you make them all for 10. Well, now you have 80 servings, right? For 10 people. And you just have way too much food. So I think making sure to make, especially all those side dishes for not as many people as you have coming is a key factor. And similarly, like, if everything is sized to only have that with like 1 or 2 other things. If you're going to have a lot of side dishes, just ratchet everything down by, a quarter or a third, and you'll hit the mark much more accurately. Now, a lot of people do love leftovers. So I think it's fine to make a little bit more so you can have those for the next day or two. Most people only like them for, however, a day or maybe two, right? So another trick is having containers on hand, or asking your guests to bring containers so that they can take leftovers home too. And I think it's up to the host to really manage and offer that, because otherwise people think it's rude to ask to take stuff home, right? So making sure you have those containers on hand, not letting that be a hurdle, is another key thing. And then lastly, freezing food. Many people think that freezers are kind of long-term storage. You put something in there and get it out 3 months later or 6 months later, but they're actually really good short-term storage as well. And almost anything can be frozen. In my opinion, we vastly underutilize our freezers, and they're like a magic pause button that we can put on food. You can freeze pasta, rice, cheese, milk, beans, half of the pasta sauce you don't use, eggs, if you kind of take them out of the shell and scramble them, but don't cook them. So a lot of things can be frozen. And I think if we think of that, especially around Thanksgiving, when we get sick of our leftovers, it's a great thing to do with them for later.
Those are great tips. Thank you, Dana. Your early background was actually in energy. And as a society, we've certainly learned a lot about energy efficiency over the years. And that's what the Urban Green audience is all about, is about energy efficiency in buildings. But there have to be analogies here. So what are the analogies between food and energy, food waste and energy efficiency?
Yeah, I have to say, I think my background, I focused on energy efficiency in college. It was like my concentration for my major. So I spent a lot of time focused on that. And then when I came to working in the food industry, it's what really struck me, was how numb the entire industry was to the whole efficiency concept. Everyone was so focused on like organic and how food was being produced, and could we get these farmers to use, be like 5% more efficient with their water use. And nobody was looking downstream to think about like, whoa, wait, 35-40% of this food is actually not being eaten. And it struck me as a perfect parallel to energy efficiency, but in the food sector, but nobody was doing it. Both energy and food are very resource intensive industries that are both looking ahead towards the future at an increase in demand because of changing habits and tastes, right? And growing need for refrigeration and lighting and whatever it is in developing countries, and in food, it's changing preferences towards more animal products that are more resource intensive. So both that and then growing populations. And so they're very parallel in that sense. And yet energy is like, 3 decades ahead of food in terms of looking at it from that streamlining and efficiency lens of how do we do it. And all the way through to households, right? The whole compact, the CFL that now is the LED, right? Effort of how do you like get people to switch out their light bulbs, and how do you get them paying attention to how hot their water heater is? All of that. I think there are a lot of parallels. I will say I have some envy. I have some energy envy in the sense that food is more complicated when it comes down to it. As complicated as energy is and can be, in the end, it is a kind of single commodity that is somewhat fungible in certain ways. And with food, there are so many things that are specific to the specific food product type, and it's perishable and it's perishability. And so it's much harder to come up with these like kind of singular, like if you switch this, all of a sudden you're going to make a big difference kind of solutions.
Great. Well, I'll remind the audience, I'm going to ask Dana a couple more questions, and we're going to get to the audience questions. You use slido.com with the code WASTE, and there are a ton coming in already. Okay. So thanks for those. We'll get to those soon. So Dana, what's the role for federal or state policy here?
Yes, absolutely. There is a role. I will say we have seen stronger movement at the state level than we've seen federally. But I guess a few things to mention. So the USDA and EPA and now FDA have a joint tri-agency goal. They've aligned with the international goal to cut food waste in half by 50% by 2030. Hugely ambitious for the short 8 years we have to go here. But that does exist, and I think it was announced in 2016, 2015. It has been very slow to move at the federal level. So, the truth is we have not seen a lot of funding put into it federally. We have not seen all that many programs that are have teeth to them put into it at the federal level. So I think there's opportunity at the federal level to really drive through incentives, through just funding some of the infrastructure that's needed for composting and just managing organics. Also the infrastructure that's needed for food rescue. We saw during the pandemic a lot of bottlenecks because there wasn't enough cold storage to store food to be able to then donate it. So food banks and other food rescue groups just didn't have the infrastructure they needed to be able to perform that and really kind of use as much food as could be available. At the state level, we've seen, and the thing about waste is it is not really a federally managed issue because waste happens locally and it doesn't tend to cross state lines. It falls within state and local jurisdictions. So some of the strongest policy we're seeing on it is at the state level. Both California and New York are actually the leaders in this right now, because both of those states have implemented a law that has some restriction that does not allow food to go to landfills, but also has a component where it is near mandating, not quite mandating, but near mandating donation of healthy edible food. So actually there were 7 states right now that have some kind of restriction on food going to landfills, but only New York and California have that component where they're actually encouraging donation as well. And in both states, they're going into effect in January of 2022. So it will be very interesting to see what happens there. I think one of the key flips that we're going to see is around food donation, because right now, food businesses see donation as a, kind of an effort of goodwill, if you will. They do get a lot of tax incentives for doing it, but nevertheless, it generally is something that they see as doing as goodwill, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay for. While they're paying for their garbage bills, they're paying for their compost to be picked up sometimes, they are not paying for their food to be handled even more carefully so that it can be eaten. I think with these laws, what we're going to see is that that gets flipped on its head, and that we're going to start seeing collection of food for donation as a paid service that businesses are going to start having to pay for, just like other collection.
And then what about, well, that's actually exciting because the timing of this program is good. I mean, these laws are coming into effect literally in like 5 weeks. So
Yeah.
We'll have to monitor those closely. But what about a city like New York? What can a big city do?
Yeah, well, for those who aren't aware, New York has actually created a ban on, they have what's called an organics ban. And that essentially is a ban on food going to landfills and requiring food to be separated from other garbage into a different bin and then collected and sent to compost, or in some places, I believe in New York, it is getting sent to compost. And New York is the biggest city to try to do this. I believe they started in Staten Island with some pilots and then have been slowly rolling it out across the whole city. I know that it's gone through some bumps due to the pandemic and was paused for a while, but is now picking it back up and rolling out that organics collection again. And there's a lot of logistics, as you can imagine, to doing that, even from the built environment side of things, right? Because there needs to be room for an extra bin, and then both where, the people are collecting in their homes, but also where it's being collected by the waste haulers, et cetera. So I think that's been a huge step that New York has taken. There are some other steps, things that happen in the school districts in the cities. We can look at school lunches as an opportunity. A lot of kids are required to take food in order for that school to be reimbursed for the food, but they don't eat it, right? So you have these like full cartons of milk that go straight to the garbage can. Well, some schools are moving towards doing things like share tables, where there's, at least if you're not going to use it, you can put it on a table and others can take it either for there or to take it home. So we are starting to see some movement there. Even better, they're moving towards like milk dispensers where you don't have to take a whole thing. And then of course there's kind of a look at the bigger laws around why they have to take them in the first place, but that goes beyond the city level.
So my last question to you before we get to all the audience questions, Dana, is if you could ask our audience to do one thing on this issue, what would you want it to be?
I would say that starting with your own waste is a great place to start. And I know that maybe sounds a little bit like cliche, but the thing is, once you start to see it, you see it everywhere, and that's where you really see opportunities. And I think, when you start to see it in your own home, when you start to do something about it in your own home, you become much more sensitized to other places that it's happening and where within your own sphere of influence, you can actually make a difference. So again, maybe a little cliche, but I think really trying to work on it in your own life, you start to see it everywhere, and that's where the opportunities become apparent.
Great. Well, thank you, Dana. Dana, you're breaking the internet with all the questions coming in. This might be a record at Urban Greens. We have 22 questions so far. I don't think we're going to get to them all, but we're going to try our best, and I'll try to group a lot of them. So the first audience question is here, which has 4 votes. On Slido, you can vote up. So for those watching at home, if you see a question you like, vote it up. This first question, Dana, what is the latest research on food meal kits like HelloFresh, Blue Apron, and their impact on food waste?
So meal kits are actually one of our top solutions. So I should say that our second edition of that initial report we said is actually an online interactive tool that I was mentioning. And as part of that, we've analyzed 42 different solutions for how much food they can save and how much they kind of cost or save in dollars. Meal kits are one of our top solutions when it comes to just how much food can be saved. And that is because they do a lot of the behaviors that we want to see consumers doing for them, right? They plan, they like resist buying extra stuff when they're shopping, and they portion things in a way that you don't have to buy extra stuff. So, and people don't tend to buy them unless they're going to use them. Like they don't tend to throw a whole meal kit away. So between all of that, we find that meal kits are a great solution when it comes to having less food waste in households. I think, the challenge for those kits has been packaging, that sometimes they require more packaging. I know all those companies it's their number one challenge that they've been working on, but also you're starting to see the concept of meal kits actually appear, what I like to think of as meal kit 2.0 kind of appear in stores as well. And so, it's kind of the choose your own meal for tonight kind of approach is its own form of meal kit as well, and that does have less packaging.
Thank you. Next question here is, why is the American mindset so difficult to change? If we can help solve this problem, maybe we can have a whole bunch of issues, but it is relatable here. It seems as if abundance and waste are synonyms for wealth. So the question here is tapping into a relevant aspect of this issue, which is in the United States and Europe, food is wasted at the household level because frankly, we can afford it, where it's not in developing countries, it's wasted in the distribution chain. How do we start to reconcile that? I mean, an obvious answer is raise food prices, right? But we know that's not going to go over well. So how does ReFed think about that?
Yeah, well, it sounds like food prices are raising themselves these days, whether or not we do anything about it. But uh, you know, I think there's a key part to this that is about like social pressure. So I do think about like littering as an interesting parallel to learn from. Um, because to the extent that we consume food in public, which is only a portion of our food, but um, it's not right now we're very numb to wasting food. It's actually very socially acceptable. If I, have people over for dinner and then we clear dinner and we scrape our plates into the garbage and then we keep going. That's just like a thing we do, right? When you're looking at a restaurant, you eat out with somebody, you don't finish things, you just get up and leave. That is like a perfectly acceptable thing to do. So I think if we can increase the social pressure around this, that and make it a little bit more taboo to not waste food or to waste food, um, that will actually go a long way in our consciousness around it and in changing behavior. Um, how do we do that? That is where I think these old school, big, long-term social change campaigns like littering are something to look to. With a new age twist of influencers and social media, and however it's done best today. But it doesn't happen in a year, and I think that was the pitfall we fell into when we tried to do Save the Food. Was we only had funding for a few years, and you don't create that level of change and that level of like culture shift in a short period of time.
Thank you. Next question, and a good one. Is veganism saving the world?
um a vegan diet has a much lower food footprint. I mean, there's just no question about it. So is it saving the world? I think I will tell you that I live in Northern California in the Lake Tahoe area, and this has been the most intense year you could imagine for us, with fires and smoke and school being canceled because of smoke, and evacuees and evacuations, um and just my kids not being able to sleep because they're afraid of fire. It's been very, very real for us on the climate change front here. And the one thing that I looked around and felt like I could do was um to become a vegetarian. And then I looked around at my real life and felt like, well, I'm not sure I can actually become a full vegetarian. So I, as a result of all the smoke and fires, became a 90% vegetarian this year. And I think, but being vegan, moving, I don't think everyone has to be vegan. I think that's a really tall ask for where we're starting out. But I do think that we all can take steps to eat less meat and dairy. Those are the biggest. They have a huge footprint. And so absolutely eating a more plant-forward diet is one of the top things we can do in our own lives that we have control over today to make a real impact on climate change.
Our new mayor in New York is a vegan, and so I think we'll see some interesting new food policies coming from New York City in the new administration. Next question here is, what are some food waste careers we can tap? That's an interesting question. I haven't heard discussed that before.
That is an interesting one. Well, there's not, I would say, a ton of career openings in this field yet. And what I've seen to be most successful is really creating them. And what I mean by that is, I think the biggest champions in this space are like people that are working within the supply chain, big food buyers who all of a sudden start to care about this issue and really look at ways that they can tweak the buying of food at, some large company. There are a lot of people who are innovators, that are startups that are creating solutions and are becoming really successful. I mean, we just had our first food waste unicorn hit $1 billion valuation in the space. So I think, whether it's working at a food company and really trying to impact how they do things, you're not going to find them posting like a food waste position. But if you are in procurement, if you are in merchandising, there are tons of roles within, even if you're in finance, right, that can really have an impact on this space.
Next question here. Let's get practical. Are there, where'd that question go? Here we go. Any suggestions for the best way to shop for food to avoid waste? Like what do you do? What's your personal trick?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I think there's two kinds of people out there. There's those who are like really good planners and organizers, and they really like nail this issue by being good on that front. I'll come back to that in a second. And then the other kind are people who are not very good planners. And I think those people get really good at using everything up that they have, regardless of kind of what they have. So now if you can do both, that's even better. So, shopping, best tips for shopping is honestly planning your meals and using a shopping list. It is very old school. And again, it does not have to be sitting there with a cookbook for 2 hours on Sunday night. It can just be like, okay, let me do a really quick sketch. This is what I do. I go to my whiteboard and I just go like, all right, we're gonna have fish on Tuesday, pasta on Wednesday. What do I need? My whiteboard is on my fridge. I open my fridge. What do I have? Right. And sometimes you can start with like, what do I have that I need to use up? What are the sort of the obvious meals that come out of that? Okay, now let me put that on the list. What else do I need to get for the other stuff? And I'm very imprecise about it, because I have also gotten really good at using stuff up. And I think that is really what I lean on, is having a couple meals in my pocket that I know the kids will eat, that I, can make pretty quickly, and that can use basically anything I have. And just incorporating those into my week on a very regular basis.
My own tip that I'll share is similar to yours, is to shop with a plan and not shop with your eyes. So before I became an advocate for food waste reduction, I would shop with my eyes like most consumers. And by the way, the singular aisle that every American walks into a food store is the fresh produce aisle, because it is the most beautiful in the grocery store. And it encourages you to shop with your eyes, which leads to overabundance, and it leads to buying too much. And so I literally have been able to reduce our food waste in our household by just, when I pick an item up, if I don't have a plan for it, no matter how beautiful or how cool it is, it doesn't go in the basket. And so shopping with a plan, as you said, can help. It's a simple thing, but it's a way for people to avoid the over shopping by shopping with our eyes on just what looks good.
Yeah. And I think just one other thing to add to that is, I think we want more variety than we do. And most of us are really creatures of habit and eat the same meals like a lot of times. And therefore, I actually think when shopping online can really help you, because it tells you what you bought last time. You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to make that again. And then, you can add a little bit of variety in there, but sort of being comfortable with the fact that you like the things you like to eat. And then I think that online shopping helps resist all of the ways in which when you walk into a store, they're trying to get you to buy more.
Next question here is, can you talk more about food insecurity in the United States? The pandemic exposed this issue, which was sometimes hard to believe. Food banks were needed now more than ever before.
Yes, it's just, I think, one of the most shameful things about our very successful country is that we have, 1 in 8, the numbers kind of are always shifting, but about 1 in 8 people in this country faces food insecurity. And it's a challenge on multiple levels, right? Rescuing food and donating it is not a solution to food insecurity. It is a Band-Aid, right? It's giving people the fish, not teaching them how to fish, or whatever analogy you want to use. So really at the root it's poverty, it's inequality, it's, how food is being distributed. And those are not issues we take on at ReFed. They're not even issues that most food banks take on. But food banks are a really important Band-Aid right now. And it's not just food banks. There's an entire network and system of food relief that exists out there. I think what we saw during the pandemic that was particularly interesting was that, so food banks have traditionally worked with kind of, if you think about it, like what you see in the grocery store, with those types of food, but not with prepared foods. What we saw during the pandemic was a lot more restaurants getting involved in like the food relief activity. Either converting restaurants to be like cooking food for people who needed it, or sometimes they had the delivery services that are involved. They were getting a lot more involved because now people weren't leaving their homes, so instead of putting stuff in a food pantry, it now needed to get delivered to their homes or things like that. So we saw a lot of evolution during the pandemic in that whole space, and I think some of it is really promising in terms of getting more people engaged, highlighting what the needs are to make that system work better, and that not necessarily, however, in solving the root causes of food insecurity.
And one of the things that I think we also found in the pandemic is an issue that's always been there, is that food banks don't have the storage capacity, particularly the safe refrigerated storage capacity for fresh foods. And there was a lot of famous news coverage at the beginning of the pandemics of milk getting dumped and eggs being smashed because there simply wasn't an outlet to do it. I'll never forget, there was a farmer who was literally crying, lamenting the fact that he was pouring milk down a drain. He says, "I've tried to donate this milk. Nobody will take it because there isn't the capacity to store it." So it really speaks to how finely calibrated our food system is. And then when there's disruption, we don't have the ability to actually divert the food to different places. And that refrigeration angle is big. Are those issues that you look at ReFed, is like, how do you expand that type of capability for food banks?
We do, yeah. We look at kind of what are some of the policy changes that need to be made to encourage more donation. What is the amount of funding that we think is needed? Where should it come from? So, it's not just, I think cold storage refrigeration is a really key piece, because the whole food bank system was actually built on non-perishables. And so most food banks were not kind of initially, the whole system was initially created to deal with stuff that was not refrigerated. And now there's much more of a push to deal with that product, mostly because it's healthier. And we want to see healthier food going to that whole system. Some of it's donated, some of it's purchased, but there is a huge need. Now, then you have food banks, which are like the big warehouses. There's also a need for refrigeration. There's actually even more of a need for it at that, what we call like the end agency level, right? So food banks are these big warehouses. They now, like the sophisticated ones, do have huge coolers, maybe not enough during the pandemic. Some places were bringing in like trucks that were refrigerated and parking them on the side of the food bank just to add to that capacity during the pandemic. But even in general, like the church basement that is, serving soup on a Sunday, like they only have one refrigerator, right? Or the domestic abuse shelter that is also feeding the people there. Like all of those places, the food pantries, they all need that cold storage as well. And so actually that end agency need is just as great, if not greater.
Here's a good question, must be from an architect. It says, are there tools that design professionals can use to help reduce food waste in homes? For example, smaller fridges, fewer kitchen cabinets, smaller kitchens. What's the trend in this area?
Oh my goodness. There was an architecture firm that once contacted me because they were gonna reinvent the kitchen and had some really great ideas on this front. And I love thinking about this. It's super challenging, as you all probably know better than I do, because the kitchen dimensions are very locked in. They're very standardized, right? This counter depth thing and whatnot. So, and like the space that is created for refrigerators. And I think New York, in some cases, like best practice, because I've never seen as many adults have small fridges as happens in New York. But yes, if I had a wand, I would make refrigerators smaller. That would be the number one thing I would do. I think it's interesting to consider interim temperature options. So like our refrigerators either have like two temperatures, like cold and frozen, but there's actually a number of products that do pretty well in that interim, like 50 to 60 degree root cellar kind of place. So thinking about, could you have a drawer or something that could do that? Um, and just making kitchens appealing so that people want to cook, because cooking is without cooking, cooking is a key part to using everything that you buy, right? And so a lot of these like teensy kitchens that don't have a lot of room and aren't like very encouraging for space is another problem too. But my number one wish would be for smaller refrigerators.
All right. Next question here. What are good ways to reduce food waste in the workplace and engage employees? What infrastructure needs to be in place to successfully compost in a New York City office? So let's break those apart. Let's think about the workplace for a moment, recognizing it's not the number one area, but it's one that many can relate to. What are best practices to avoid food waste in the workplace? And then once it happens, what are best practices to manage it?
Yeah, so I think, goodness, the workplace is an interesting environment, right? You have shared refrigerators, you have events where other people are ordering food, and then you have like everyone going down for lunch, to go buy lunch in the middle of the day. So I think those are kind of three separate workplace instances. Probably the biggest opportunity is in those events that take place. I think the best thing that that you can do for workplace events, especially the 20-person meeting or something, is to get individual orders, because a lot of times like there's one person ordering for a bunch of people and they just order too much. Bottom line, right? Of course, there's a lot of places that will put the food out to the dogs afterwards, right? And that tends to work in some places. But generally speaking, I think getting individual orders for events is a good practice. Being really clear in shared food areas about what is not to be taken and what actually can be taken. I think sometimes people are willing, have stuff in there to be shared, but other people don't realize it. So like simple labels can go a long way. I always say knives on the muffin tray can go a long way. I love all those morning meetings that have like, croissants and muffins, and like nobody eats a whole huge croissant. They've already had breakfast probably, right? So like putting a knife on that tray, I think can go a long way in people actually having some of it. So those are just some ideas. The built environment, like what needs to be in place for composting. There was actually a project in New York City by an architect there who tried to look at like what are the building design requirements that should be in place, even maybe into code for a city that's requiring composting to allow this space. It really boils down to the space for bins. And then I know New York, certainly in the residential context, has that like added complication of the chutes. I don't know what to say about those, but generally speaking, I think it comes down to having clear signage about what can go in, just like recycling, clear signage about what can go in which bin. And then of course, having the bin, having the space for the bin, having the bin, and then having clear signage about what can go in it.
There's a question about waste disposers in the sink. It's common in the U.S. and New York City is recognized and legalize them. What's ReFed's view of sink waste disposals as a means to divert food waste?
I would say we are evolving on that, to be honest. We have seen some recent greenhouse gas analyses that actually say that sewer, as compared with landfill, sewer actually has a much higher greenhouse gas footprint. And that's kind of new information for me. So I'm still trying to vet it, kind of like interrogate it and see if we really agree with that and try to understand it. And also that, because really what it comes down to is the wastewater treatment plants and what their capacity is and how they operate, how much energy they use to grind it, right? If you're landfilling food, it goes to landfill, it creates methane. And that's a problem as it rots there. But apparently wastewater treatment plants have kind of their own methane production. So depending on if that is captured or not, that's an issue. And then they also have a lot of energy that goes into grinding all the food to get it to a small enough size that it can be processed. So whether that's happening, that grinding's happening in the home, but then again, it's happening at the treatment plant, I think there's a lot of energy that goes into that. Some of the issues, yeah. So I would say I'm in an interim moment of trying to really decide what I think about garbage disposals.
That's fair enough. We have 2 minutes. I'm going to try to do 2 more questions. Next question here is, could you expand on the waste at supermarkets? Is it poorly handled food, the need to look exclusive? Is it overpriced that ends up in the trash bins? Why is that happening in supermarkets?
Yeah, I think fundamentally what is driving waste in supermarkets is that they are trying to keep an inventory of a lot of items. So not in New York City probably, but in most places, the average grocery store carries about 50,000 different items, and they are trying to have that in stock for you from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and give you all your choices. So I think that fundamentally is the challenge. We are seeing, and therefore what happens is they buy more than they need. They don't want their shelves to be empty, and so they tend to lean towards overbuying, and it's really hard to get that equation right for every single item. So I'd say that is the root cause. Also, the date labels we talked about cause a problem because some consumers are confused and think food is bad on those dates. Grocery stores don't want to sell anything on, or certainly not after those dates. And so they tend to actually remove product 2 to 3 days before the dates so that their product comes across as fresh and doesn't scare anyone away. So fixing the confusion is one opportunity. And then there's a lot of big data solutions that are coming out around the forecasting, and getting product there is another. And then, as consumers, being a little more patient with our stores, and, sort of it's okay for them to run out of stuff, that would go a long way as well.
Great. So the final question here, Dana, and there's lots of variations on the theme, people who want to see your roadmap and learn more, tell them where to find your resources at ReFed.
Yes, please come join us. So ReFed, refed.org. You can find it all. There's a big button on the right that says Insights Engine if you want to go play around on that tool. We host a network with a lot of programming called the Food Waste Action Network. So you're welcome to join that. It's free, or sign up for a newsletter, and you'll hear about, we do kind of 1 to 2 programs a month where we try to dive into specific issues. We're always happy to take suggestions of issues and try to find the right people who can speak about those as well. So yes, please come join us. Take a look in your fridge, see what you can cook from dinner out of there tonight instead of going shopping, and enjoy your Thanksgiving.
Well, Dana, we're so thrilled that you spent the hour with us here at Urban Green at a very busy time. So thank you very much. And thank you for all that you do on this really important issue.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love dipping into places where other topics are often discussed. So it's nice to be able to introduce a new one, and love what you all are up to. So thank you so much, John.
Great. So today's program is a great example of the work that we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions to have the biggest impact. And we do that through our 4 key activities. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. If you're not already a member of Urban Green, check us out to support our work. Thank you, Dana, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us today. We'll see you next time, and happy Thanksgiving.